Hello, I'm Jamie Mackinlay, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Just Get a Real Job. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome back on the podcast someone who we've had on a few times now, and the first conversation I had with this man meant a lot to me and was one of our sort of best episodes from last year in terms of the engagement we got. It's an absolute privilege to welcome on Philip Ralph. How are you doing, Phil? Lovely to see you.
I'm doing really well, Jamie. It's really good to see you, and thank you for having me back on. I feel like we're sort of like that Michael Spicer sketch now of podcasters talking about, oh, so you were on last year, regular guest.
Yeah, regular guest though. But listen, I mean, I think last year's conversation, I know from speaking to you since and stuff, had like a nice impact on both of us. And it was a really great conversation, which really connected to a lot of people. So it's basically coming up for a year since we recorded that. So I just wanted to have you back on, reflect on the last year in terms of the TV industry. So for anyone listening that maybe didn't listen to the last episode, me and Phil recorded an episode which I called "What the Fuck Has Happened to the TV Industry," and it was basically all about the crisis facing the screen sector, which sadly a year on is still continuing to affect many freelancers and people working. As I speak to Phil, I'm drinking out of a River City mug. As many of the regular listeners will know, like I'm out of a job in 6 months, etc. But Phil, do you want to just sort of recap for people listening as well a bit of who you are? I know we sort of talked a lot about your origin story last time I had you on the show, but give us a bit of a recap for anyone, maybe newer listeners that haven't listened to that first conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a screenwriter. I've been working in the arts and in the creative industries my whole professional life. So I'm from a working class background in Halifax, West Yorkshire. I went to RADA and trained at RADA as an actor. And then about 10 years into my acting career, sort of really fortunately for me, sort of slowly segued into writing, but initially plays and then for television, and I became a regular writer on Doctors, the BBC's daytime soap, which I wrote on off and on for 19 years, and then and then put a stupidly long thread about the end of Doctors onto Twitter on the last day that it was in production, and started another life as I keep referring to myself as the industry's Cassandra, basically kind of constantly saying the sky is falling and nobody's listening. So yeah, I'm really passionate about what's going on in the TV industry and how it's impacting the sustainability of the industry, but particularly how it's impacting individuals, both who are already in the industry and who want to get into the industry. And I think probably because I think if I was starting out now from my background, I wouldn't be able to get in. And I think that's really probably what motivates me, is that sense of, well, actually, and me getting in was incredibly fortunate in all sorts of ways, which I might talk about. But it's about actually, it always has been, but it's becoming an incredibly privileged place. And I think that's impacting the stories that we see. And I think it's impacting the future of television. So that's what I'm really passionate about.
Yeah. So, I mean, last time we had you on, Phil, we sort of talked about the screen crisis in general and a lot of the reasons behind that. And I think what would be good this time, and for the listeners, you're this week about to record a keynote speech, and I sort of who's it for again? Off the top, I've forgotten off the top of my head.
It's at the University of Leeds in their media department. I was invited by Laura Miner, who works there, to give a keynote. So that it's the opening keynote of a day-long symposium on class in the TV industry, and my keynote is about class in the TV industry.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, that's kind of what this episode's going to be all about. I think it would be really good to talk to you about class in the TV industry, particularly as with the wider context of what we sort of covered before and what we covered in you were part of a panel I put together at the start of the year about, called "We Survived to 25, What Happens Now?" And interestingly, we're near the end of 2025 and there's still a lot of the same problems affecting people. Since obviously I mentioned River City at the start of the episode as well, since we last spoke as well, that's coming. So it's now affected me directly. All the stuff I spoke to you about 6 months later sort of ended up affecting me, and that's always kind of weirdly interesting as well. But yeah, I really want to talk about class, and you very kindly sent me your keynote across, so there's lots of themes from that I want to ask you about and stuff. But you referred to yourself as the industry's Cassandra, so I just wanted to quickly say something because I opened this episode up to listeners as well, so we got a few questions sent in which I'll work in today. But one of our listeners described you as the TV's Mick Lynch, so I think that's quite a nice compliment.
I'm bald. I'm bald like McLynch. I'm working class. Wow, that's an extraordinary compliment.
I hope that's the compliment.
That's gonna be on my that's going on my tombstone. Listen, if there's anybody to aspire to, to be like, it's Mick Lynch. I'm very happy about that. TV's Mick Lynch.
Well, I sort of one of the things that I wanted to speak to you about, Phil, is you talk about, and you mentioned this last time when you were on, but you talked about how a lot of the changes that have happened in TV, it's not like a blip, it's a paradigm shift. So I mean, that's a good
Yeah,
place to start, just to recap
yeah.
the context for our listeners, and we can sort of go into some of the more deep stuff. But can you explain that again, like what you mean by the fact this is a paradigm shift? It's not just a one-off blip that's going to affect us for years.
Well, I think it's been really interesting in the past year, because I've been listening. I try and keep my ear to the ground. And I should sort of preface all this by saying I'm not, I'm just somebody who works in the industry. I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert. I'm not in the rooms where it happens. So it's all about kind of observing this from the outside. But I've been listening to, there's a new podcast by Jimmy Mulville and Peter Fincham, Insiders, about sort of working in TV, and they're kind of big beasts who have been, I think Peter ran the BBC or ran ITV, and they're very, and Jimmy's at Hat Trick and stuff. And it's been very interesting listening to them, because I think their take on what's going on in the industry is, oh well, it's boom and it's bust and things come and go. And I don't agree with that. And I think the reason I don't agree with that is because as I describe in the keynote that you've read, Jamie, that the kind of the mechanisms by which television is made in this country have changed and are changing at such a rapid pace. And I know that there were some fantastic panels that are starting to come online now from the Edinburgh TV Festival that just happened. And the first one, chaired by Roz Atkins, sort of a big panel talking about, and he sort of starts with like 12 minutes of what is going on. And basically the model that has been established and has been working for a long time, certainly ever since I came into the industry, of 5 television channels, some of them public service broadcasters, i.e. publicly funded, some of them privately owned and funded by advertisers. That model is changing incredibly rapidly. And what it means is that in practice, along with a lot of other factors, but what it means in practice is the amount of television that's being made in the UK market for the UK market is dropping, and dropping really rapidly. And what that means is that indies, who make the vast majority of television in this country, are really up against it. So since we last spoke, loads of indies have gone to the wall, and really, really big ones as well. Ones that it's really surprising to see that they ended up having to fold. And what that means is there's less work. And because the vast majority of the TV industry workforce are freelance, there's less work for them. So we have this massive talent drain from the industry of freelance people, because they simply can't sustain themselves without work for these long periods of time. And why, to me, that feels like a paradigm shift rather than just, oh, well, it's just a readjustment, is that actually, and I heard this echoed again on that Edinburgh Film Festival, TV Festival panel, was this sense that nobody knows what the end game is. Nobody knows where this is going, and nobody can get a real sense of, well, so if it is, as other people say, oh, it's just an adjustment. Well, what's the end point? What's the point that people can go, okay, it's settled again? And we're not there yet. We're absolutely not there yet. I mean, very recently in the headlines, you'll have seen it as well, I'm sure, the number 2 watched channel now in the UK is YouTube. And so a lot of the terrestrial channels, a lot of the traditional channels are trying really quickly to get their content onto YouTube in an accessible way that still means that they can pay for it. And that's one of the big issues, is that our 5 channels can't afford to pay for the television that they want to make. So there's a lot of work that they've said, yes, we'd like it, but then they've turned around to the indie and gone, we can only give you half the budget you want for this. So that to me doesn't feel like, oh, it's just kind of resettling, it's just an adjustment. It feels like actually the whole ground underneath everybody's feet is still shifting, still moving, and nobody really knows where it's going to settle and where it's going to land.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's a really frightening time. It's a really scary time. And I think it's very interesting. We were talking on the panel that I did with you earlier in the year about, the kind of, everybody was kind of bemoaning, survive to 25. A year on, I don't hear very much exist to 26. Right. And that's not just because Survive to 25 was always bollocks, but it's actually more about, I think, an awful lot of the people who tried to survive to 25 aren't here anymore in terms of they've had to step away from the industry. They've had to retrain. They've had to find some other way of keeping the roof over their head. So it is, people aren't hanging on. And I think that's why the crisis has dropped from the headlines as well. Was really struck. John McVeigh, who is the current outgoing chief executive of Pact, talked about how he felt the industry didn't move fast enough and didn't retrain and reskill a lot of these freelancers for this change, and so they've lost them. And he calls that a tragedy. And I think it is a tragedy that the industry didn't move fast enough and hasn't moved fast enough to try and retain a lot of these people. So yeah, that's a whistle stop tour.
And I mean, we're talking about class and TV. It's $1,000 to go to that festival. So I'm not wanting to quit.
Right,
I'm not
right.
wanting
Not, and that's not including your accommodation.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And I'm not trying to criticize some of the work the TV and film charity do. I think it's very important, but I think the fact that TV's main festival costs $1,000 to go to is a blaring example of the class inequalities in our industry, especially at a time right now. And they did give out quite a lot of free passes this year, in fairness to them, but it's still not. The gates do still, from my POV, not having to go anyone, but they do feel very close. No, I was lucky enough to go to some of the talks, and it was interesting to hear people talking about the things you mentioned. But at the same time, still sometimes did feel like there wasn't enough reality, like from people that maybe are, and I don't want to use the word ivory towers because it feels a bit cliche, but do you know what I mean? They maybe just aren't in that. They just don't really know. Many people are just haven't realised the reality on the ground, and from someone on the ground, especially in Scotland, and where it was in already an industry that maybe didn't have hundreds and hundreds of opportunities, it does feel really like pretty hopeless. And I'm not saying I'm giving up and I'm not going to keep looking for jobs, but I've been at Riverside for nearly 2 and a bit years, and in that time I've seen maybe 3 realistic things I could have gone for as a script editor, where I could stay where I live,
Yeah,
and make a living. That's nothing, and that's coming from someone at a mid-level career with quite good experience and good connections, and I might still yet find something, but if people at my level are finding it hard from a working class background, like God knows how you even start, or like it's mental. And I think that is, people listening might find that frustrating, but it's the reality. And I think it's important for us to be honest about that. And a lot of that will tie into the themes of class that we're going to be talking about tonight.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we talked about obviously last time, the fact that one of the first things to start to really feel the pinch in an overt way in the industry are the soaps, Holby City, Doctors, now River City, you know, and I think it is fair to say that the soaps as an entity came into being because they were designed to tell working class stories, and they are, or they were at least, these kind of factories for drama, and to mass produce drama on a big scale, a lot of it, a lot of hours, a lot of people working on them. Lots of people did what basically amounted to apprenticeships. I certainly did. And not only that, but then people could make a consistent living in the place where they live. And I think, as they go, what we'll see now is, the work will just slide south as it has been doing, and it is increasingly hard then because for all the kind of talk from all the channels about, oh yes, we absolutely want to invest in the regions, the reality is, there's been a big thing recently in Birmingham where there's been an announcement of 2 new shows that are going to be made in Birmingham, and that is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but then when you think about how much in terms of hours and how many people were employed on Doctors on an annual basis, and then you go, oh, we're going to do 2 new shows, and you go, great, but it's not even scratching the surface of the people who were working there and who were making a living there and able to live where they worked. So it's really quite scary in that regard, definitely.
No, for sure. And I think something which frustrated me when River City was cancelled, and I did a lot of work with this podcast on this issue to have these quite frank and open conversations. It's great that the BBC have committed and said we're going to invest in Scotland, and they have commissioned 3 new dramas. But I think the point a lot of people aren't understanding is that's really good and positive, right? But these dramas only film for maybe 3 months a year, if that. They can't sustain someone who doesn't have a financial backing behind them or the sustainability, they can't sustain someone to work for the long term. So even if I was lucky enough to get a job like that for 3 months or 4 months, I'd probably end up being unemployed again for at least, several months, or there's a risk of that. And then people decide, well, it's better to just go and get a job somewhere else. And then you are excluding working class people from the industry. And that's the issue. And that's why people,
Yeah, and that's not even factoring in the major issue in the regions. I'm sure you will have seen. I think he's called Peter Strachan. I've never met him, or Peter Strawn, depending on how it's pronounced.
Strachan, yeah.
Who's doing really. Peter Strachan is doing really, really important work in holding to account these announcements of, oh, we're going to make this show in Scotland, and then go, right. So what's the percentage of the crew on that show who are actually Scottish and based in Scotland? Like Traitors, for example, he's been highlighting that amongst other things. He's been doing incredible work, and I think that's one of the things that I'm really hyper aware of. Is we're an industry that thrives on spin. We thrive on everything's great and everything's wonderful, and we are really, really not good at examining ourselves and going, actually, this isn't great, and the reality is that what it means on the ground is there are fewer and fewer jobs. And going back to class, those jobs then are going to more and more of the same people, because as I talked about last time, I don't believe that the television industry, or indeed the world, frankly, but I don't believe that the television industry is a meritocracy. I think it's a successocracy. And what happens in that instance is people go, this person has been very successful before, let's give them more work. And oh, I know this person, so therefore I've worked with them before, so I'll work with them again because I know they deliver, blah blah blah. All the reasons might be the right ones, but what it means is that there's less jobs, fewer jobs, and fewer opportunities, and therefore it just becomes a more and more rarefied profession, and that's really concerning because for the future, because it's just not. It means that less people are able to make a living now, and it means that fewer people are able to sort of, come into the industry, get their first job, and then know that, oh, well, I'll get within some reasonable period of time, I might get a second job, and I might be able to make a living doing this and get experience and get good at it. It's not sustainable.
no, it's not at all. If you don't have money behind you, you don't have like that safety net, and you're not privileged enough to come from a privileged background, you can't take the risks that unfortunately this industry requires you to take. You have to take a lot of risks in this industry, work somewhere that you're only guaranteed employment for 6 months to a year, a terrible pension often, if you get sick.
Yeah. If you get a
Yeah, if
pension.
you get a pension. So.
And as you say, if you get sick, you have nothing, and that's the freelance life. If there's no sick pay, and they'll replace you because they need to keep making the show.
And
Yeah.
it's even worse if you're a woman, for example. Maternity, things like that are really, so again, it's just it is a really shines a light on inequality. I think actually a good thing to sort of get to maybe unpack, Phil, would be, I know in your keynote speech you're going to talk about the supermarket analogy, and you mentioned the factories of the soaps. Could you kind of talk about that briefly? Because I think that's quite an interesting aspect to this.
Yeah, all of this is just, these aren't hot takes. They're just kind of my theories, basically, as I kind of examine this. Looking at what's happened, the analogy that I make is that the sort of existing channels were sort of like, the traditional high street, which is long gone now in most British cities and towns. But sort of local shops, local retailers, they knew what the local market needed. They sourced their goods locally, et cetera, all very League of Gentlemen. And then, the streamers kind of arrived and emerged, and are doing to the television industry what Spotify arguably did to the music industry, which is basically cut away. They came in with masses of money, like the supermarkets when they arrive in these small towns. Masses of money. They can afford to undercut the prices of those pre-existing shops until they close, and then they've got a monopoly. And I think it's really, that for me is the picture that I've seen. Don't get me wrong, the streamers make incredible work, and perhaps we'll go on to talk about Adolescence, which, as we speak today, has just won a boatload of Emmys, which is fantastic. But I think Adolescence for me is a kind of a case study in what's both right and wrong. There's an amazing things to talk about there. But so I think that's what I mean by the supermarket analogy, really, is that local production can't compete. And because everything needs high-end television values, what that then means locally is, if the BBC want to make a show, it's got to look like all the shows on Netflix or on Amazon. And we can't afford to do that. And particularly now we can't afford to do it because, as we know, the license fees under threat, and that's going to be reviewed. Advertisers are fleeing the commercial channels because less people are watching them. So, they've got less money to spend. So it's this kind of perfect storm of less money to spend whilst needing to spend more to compete. So yeah, it does feel like the streamers of the supermarkets, really.
No, I think the supermarket and high street stuff is a really interesting analogy because it does feel like that. And I recently had Nick Lambon, who's a BBC commissioner, on, and I really appreciate him coming on and being honest.
Yeah,
Because
great
again, he's
session.
in a position where he can't maybe have as frank a conversation as we can have, Phil, about the state of the industry. Kind of nice to hear him talk about how the BBC know they need to try and make stuff on a lower budget. And I think, maybe it has been quite a negative. It's not the most positive thing in the world, but a positive thing that has happened is pay to play coming back, which you pitched when you came on the live show in February. So maybe they listened to you. Who knows?
I don't think so. I think, I really, really loved your conversation with Nick, and I think it was really, really important. And I think it is really important that people who are in his role, have these kind of more open conversations, because otherwise it does get to be this point where the commissioners are in their ivory towers, and all the sort of, the poor serf freelancers are desperately trying to find some way to get in there. Whereas, logically, we're all working together. And the argument I've always made, and the position I've always taken since I foolishly decided to open my big mouth, is that, people like Nick, commissioners, they're human beings, and they are doing their very, very best to make really, really good television in really difficult circumstances. So I think it's foolish to get, God knows the rest of the world is polarized enough. It's foolish to get personal about it, but information is power. And to kind of know the challenges that people like Nick face and the difficulties they face, and the fact that the pressures on people like him and other people who commission shows, the pressure on them every time they say yes, it's a massive chunk of their available budget, and they need that show to work. They need it to work. They need it to be successful. And if it isn't, it's a massive blow, and it could impact their livelihood. So what interests me is how we all function within that system, and how we work together. So I thought that was a really, really important session, and it was great that he was prepared to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated it, and thank you to all the listeners that have checked that one out. And if you haven't, yeah, if you're on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you're listening, go and have a look and listen. It's a really good chat, and I really appreciate it. Next time. We kind of touched on adolescence. I was going to bring this up, Phil, and you brilliantly mentioned it. I think that's quite an interesting thing to talk about, because there might be some listeners, and I think this was mentioned in this year's McTaggart as well. Like, I think, who did the McTaggart again? It's completely went out of my head. What was their name again?
It's so interesting. I think James Harding,
Yes, it
wasn't
was.
it?
I was
James
there
Harding
for
did
it,
the
and I've
McTaggart,
completely,
and
yeah. But he talked about, like, for people watching and TV and consuming it, it feels like there's an endless trough, basically. And for the people working in it, it feels like the commissioners have all went up Kilimanjaro and abandoned them. And I think that's a great analogy, because people listening or watching it maybe aren't as involved in the industry, aren't as geeky about it as ourselves. They might be like, well, Adolescence is a UK show and it's just won a bunch of Emmys. Like, we're fine, calm down. But that's kind of it's an interesting one, because it's kind of a juxtaposition. In a way, it's sad the BBC couldn't now make a show like Adolescence. I think that's a tragedy, actually.
right. But I suppose that's for me what's really, really interesting about Adolescence. And again, looking at that opening panel from the Edinburgh TV Festival, you probably remember this because it made some headlines. So Louisa Compton, who is head of specialist factual and news and current affairs at Channel 4, in that panel talked about Channel 4 being, quote, the proud parents of adolescence, and that the streamers are, she, quote, TV tourists. And what she meant by that, I think, is that, the public service broadcasters like Channel 4 and like the BBC, and obviously our existing channels, over the years have invested huge amounts in bringing on new talent. Jack Thorne and Stephen Graham both made many shows for Channel 4. And then, but Channel 4 and none of our channels could afford to make Adolescence. And that seems crazy. But then you think about, the one shot thing. Every time I've seen Adolescence just the once, but each episode I'm like, Jesus, this must have cost a fortune. Because in order to pull that off, however many times they ran each one of those individual takes, they had weeks of, however many weeks of rehearsals, how many extras, how much time. It must have cost a fortune, and so there's no way that our channels could have covered that. And the argument is from somebody like Louisa Compton that, Netflix, which doesn't have any, there's no demand on it to provide news. There's no demand on it to provide local services, weather, arguably anything specific to a country or a region. Their only remit is make shows that get seen a lot and make them and get more subscribers onto the platform. So the argument is that they are kind of coming along and cherry picking all this talent that has been nurtured by the PSBs, and then not putting anything back. And obviously Netflix pushed back very hard against that. But it is really fascinating that it's also something to do with risk. I think, the sense that Adolescence was a quote unquote risky proposition. And Jack Thorne said in response to the thing about TV tourists, he said the real problem in TV is a certain conservatism that's crept in because of the recession. So that thing about people don't want to take a risk, and they don't want to spend big money taking a risk, even though it's Jack Thorne and Stephen Graham and Philip Barantini, and you'd think, well, with that track record, this isn't a risk. So, and that's not even before we get onto the issues around class representation and things in Adolescence, which I'd love to talk to you about. But yeah, it's symptomatic, I think, of where we are, that shows like Adolescence or another Jack Thorne show, Toxic Town, which would have been made by our PSBs and channels, now are made by Netflix.
Yeah. I think there's two interesting things I want to pick out of that, which is a really interesting point, Phil. Firstly, talking about risk, this is a wider class thing as well. But if it's a risk to make shows with big people like that in it, that's when you go, where the hell do these young writers, or even writers like yourself that have been working in the industry for years, that haven't had that big show behind them, if we can't even take a risk without being a big streamer like Netflix on, writers that have that pedigree, then, it's going to make it even harder to have that start. And to go back to that chat I had with BBC Commissioner Nick Lambon, like he was speaking about something they're trying to remind themselves a lot of, is like, we have to try and not be too risk averse, because that's when you lose out on these great shows. And the second thing I want to pick out is this, talking about these writers like Jack Thorne. Again, this is not a knock on Jack Thorne at all, but it is sadly because of this thing I just talked about, risk. It's the same 12 to 15 writers now in the UK that get all the jobs, all the shows, and then everyone else gets squeezed. And then if you lose stuff like soaps or lower budget dramas, you're just losing hundreds of writers and hundreds of talented writers from the industry, and it is a tragedy.
Right. And that's the successocracy in action, right? And it's not coming from a malign place. It's not these commissioners and execs going, ha, 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 screw all these little people. It's just them being risk averse and going, well, Jack Thorne has an incredible record. Let's work with him. No shade on Jack Thorne, but sometimes I wonder if he ever gets any sleep, because he seems to be writing 24/7. So it is that thing, and fantastic, and he's worked very hard and he deserves it. But that then squeezes everybody out, and it not only does it, and I say this as a kind of a recovering actor, as I like to refer to myself. When I started out as an actor in the early 90s, the theatrical reps, stage reps had gone, but in a year you could probably get like an episode of Casualty, you could maybe get on an episode of The Bill, maybe get a couple of episodes or something to eke it out as a kind of an unknown actor. Now, because the industry's been so squeezed and there's less work being made, I urge your listeners to watch any TV drama and look who's playing the 1, 2, 3 scene parts. It's people you go, bloody hell, that's so and so, that's that big name. Wow, and they're playing what? They're in one scene, 2 scenes. So my TV career. So again, what that means in terms of class and in terms of kind of the industry being sustainable is you get people who they can't even get one gig a year to kind of sustain themselves. I know as a writer on Doctors, people would come in, and Doctors was terribly paid because the budgets on those shows were tiny. But people would come in and not only do they get a little bit of work, but they get to go, oh yeah, I'm an actor. I'm still an actor. And without that volume of work, you get all these people who you go, bloody hell, did they really need that job? And you go, yeah, they probably did. That big name in that 3 scene cameo probably did need that job, and they're going to get it ahead of nobody. So yeah, the knock-on effect of all of this, and I think it's what really exercises me and gets me interested, is just the systemicness of it all, the kind of how it's all interconnected. And I think it's really hard, particularly as everybody sort of is in their own silos and on their own laptops and things. I think it's really hard to not see it as malign, or there's some malicious kind of mustache twirling villain at the top going, I'm not working with those poor people. Whereas actually that's not what happens, but it's stressed people trying to keep their jobs and do their jobs well in an industry that's in drought and is in this paradigm shift, as we've been saying all along.
Completely. What's frustrating, what you want to kind of say to these big streamers, and listen, the money people will look at it and go, well, we are investing lots in the UK, and they are, to an extent, they are. It was bringing a lot for the economy, I'm not denying that, but what I'd love to try, and I try to talk about this in the podcast, and I'm sure people in government and whatever are making this, case, I hope anyway, maybe I'm being completely naive, but if they invest in the public service broadcasters here and they invest in the grassroots of our industry, it will actually benefit them. It just might not, you can't show that on a budget straight away. It's a long-term investment. If they were like, we'll give 1% of all our income, even, that's a small amount really, and we're going to invest it in the grassroots of the screen industry in the UK, it would actually mean that there'd be so much, you could create a talent pipeline, and that would actually lead to probably 10, 15 incredible hits for a streamer like Netflix. I can't prove that, sadly, but I genuinely do believe.
No, but this is where we're sort of stepping into the kind of murky areas of sort of macroeconomics, and but there was the select committee for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport last year or earlier this year recommended a levy on the streamers. So actually recommended a kind of forced, getting the streamers to pay into the sustainability of the industry. And the streamers, of course, pushed back very hard on that. But the kind of the economics of the system now, it's not calling anybody out to go, Netflix, I don't think they pay the proper rate of tax that they should pay in this country anyway, never mind, paying a streamer levy. Amazon certainly don't, Apple, et cetera, and this goes back to, in a way, the kind of, this is the other analogy that I have for kind of our public service broadcasters, that they're in the same position now that the NHS is in. The NHS is a publicly funded system designed so that people get, care at the point of need free. And originally, the original premise behind BBC, Channel 4, ITV, whatever, was that people get shows, they pay a little bit in, and they get shows free. And basically it's a socialized system of television, and that what that means is, yeah, there might be stuff that you don't want on, you might say, I'm not interested in the proms, why do I have to pay for it? And the deal is, you have to pay for it so that the arts survive enough so you get the stuff you love. And I think it's that kind of interconnectedness that people have lost sight of, and that's across the board. It's journalism, it's music, the people's disconnect with, it's on my telly, why should I have to pay any more for it? Because the people who make it, the vast majority of them, aren't making an astonishing living, if they're making a living at all. And they're really, really skilled craftspeople, and they should be making a living. It's a job. It's not a hobby. It's not a pastime. It's a job to do this. And so that the disconnect between how we pay for it and how we consume it, I think, is what's causing the problem.
Yeah, I just wish you could explain to them that it might look like right now you're spending, for example, I'll use the Riverside analogy again. I'm just going to bang on about it, but it's important. On paper, it probably looks like to be Scotland, we're saving £50 million a year we can reinvest in other things. I do get that, right? It must be so hard running that, and I do sympathise to an extent having to make that decision. It's probably not easy, right? It's a difficult decision to make. On paper, you're like, I've saved 15 million, that's good. But my argument is, in the long term, you're actually costing yourself more money, because if you lose the pipeline of talent, then you're going to have less people working for you in the future, and then you're risking having less good shows and losing revenue that way. That's how I see it. But that's a
Right.
long term way of thinking.
No, 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 but you're absolutely right. But but we've sort of lost that ability to think long term. And again, this feels like sort of macroeconomics. And I hold my hand up and say I got a U at A level in economics, so I really am flying blind here. But but for the last 15 years in terms of politics, the story we've been told is there's no money, so we have to cut everything. But yet, those who are wealthy are exponentially getting more wealthy. And as everything gets cut, public services disappear, support disappears, it all disappears. So it is illogical. It doesn't make any sense. It's short-termist to go, well, I'm not going to invest in that thing now that I'm like, oh, well, I'll save money. The short-termism of going, oh, we need to save money. Let's cut doctors. And then you go, oh, hang on, the entire infrastructure of the future of the industry just got whipped out from under our feet. And the fact that people can't put those things together comes down to, I think, that people in all these jobs are kind of in this really high pressure situation with their heads down and they can't see the bigger picture. And if they can, they're not they don't feel they're in a position to act on the bigger picture, because that could be their job. If they say, oh, no, I'm going to keep that, then somebody above them will go, well, we'll sack you then.
And that's kind of what's happening in general society. I mean, that's probably, you could apply that to what's happening right now in the UK actually as well, which is interesting.
I agree.
Let's quickly go back to Adolescence, and I want to talk. I love this. I'm my favorite bit of your keynote, by the way. And I'm a big Pulp fan. I love Common People's one of my favorite songs as well. So I really enjoyed this. But you've basically suggested, you've used Common People as an analogy, but you've suggested the Cocker test. Explain the Cocker test. I think this is fantastic, and I hope we bring it in.
Okay. Well, I hope Jarvis is ready for this. My partner this morning said, what, has he got a picture of a Cocker Spaniel? I said, no, Jarvis Cocker. So, yeah. So what sort of struck me, I was very, very struck by the Bechdel-Wallace test. The Bechdel-Wallace test stems from an American cartoonist called Alison Bechdel, who came up with this test for how women are represented in film. And the test has three components. Basically, are there at least two named female characters? Do they have a conversation about something other than men? So those are the three categories. And it struck me thinking about the representation of class on television at the moment, given the pressures for high-end television, etc. I thought, is there a way of doing a version of that for class on television? So what I came up with, and this is obviously a work in progress, is there need to be at least two named working class characters who have a conversation with somebody outside of their class about something other than crime, poverty, grimness, drugs, etc., etc. So something about the representation of how we represent class, and to kind of start to look like hold a mirror to what we're producing, in an age when high-end television and those values is meaning that, we're watching things like The White Lotus or Succession, massive production values, huge budgets, all about the wealthy. The irony that Adolescence was too expensive for our public service broadcasters and our commercial channels, too expensive for them to make, but yet it passes every single one of the strictures of the Cocker test. They are working class people living normal working class lives, and yet the conversations that they have are with people outside their class, and they're not related to crime. I mean, obviously, the central issue in Adolescence is a crime, but you can argue about whether or not that crime is related to class or not. But for me, I think that's what's really interesting, and it's really interesting to note. It's made by Warp Films. Warp Films are a famously working class outfit. The people who made it, so people like Stephen Graham, Jack Thorne, are all state educated. They're state educated people. And at a time when the proportion of people working in the television industry who are privately educated is way out of whack with the number of privately educated people in the country, it's really significant that that is the case. So it's a proudly working class show that has done phenomenally well around the world, and I think that's a fantastic thing. But at the heart of that is the difficulty of our channels couldn't afford to make it, and that's tricky because there aren't going to be many stories like Adolescence that will speak to around the world and that can be made in that extraordinary way that Philip Barantini does with the one shot per episode thing. So it's really, I think it's really, really fascinating. And the Cocker test, I think, was just my way of going, how do I start to assess, these things? Because I watch an awful lot of working class narratives written by working class writers, made by working class teams. And sometimes I come away from them feeling a bit, given my background and where I'm from, just that feeling of, is this slightly kind of patronizing? Is this slightly, denigrating? And who's it being made for? Is it being made for people from that class and that demographic? Or is it being made for other people who kind of go, I feel better about myself because I've watched a show about poor people? So there's lots of issues, but that was where the original idea came from.
What made me, I think another thing that makes me laugh so much about the Cocker test is I think most things that have been made, particularly about Scotland right now, wouldn't pass it. And I think that's sad. It is genuinely quite sad, but I'm trying to think when I read that, I was trying to think what shows have I seen recently that would pass it, and it was really hard to come up with any. What other ones apart from Adolescence do you think recently maybe have passed that test?
There were two that have really, really come to my mind. One is a fantastic show that went out on BBC Three called Just Act Normal, written by Janice Ocko, made for, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what something like Adolescence is made. And it's adapted from a play of hers. And it's about three young people who are trying to survive and trying to sort of live their lives after, spoilers, the death of their mother. And I think it's funny, it's really, really charming, heartfelt, moving, and it never feels like it's either sort of it's leering or it's kind of exploiting the fact that they are struggling for money and struggling to survive. And plus, it was a cast of complete unknowns, apart from Romola Garai, who was at the center of it, and I imagine that was probably quite instrumental in the show being made because she's quite a name. And so again, that's kind of the successocracy lending something to something. So I really love Just Act Normal. And then the other one, which I really loved, was The Gathering, which was made by World Productions for Channel 4, written by first-time writer Helen Walsh, first-time screenwriter. She's worked in a novel as a novelist before. Set in Liverpool, again made with an all Liverpool crew, and it's like a sort of if you haven't seen it, it's this extraordinary sort of cross section of society through all various kind of demographics of class. But I remember at the heart of it is a working class family living in a small terraced house in Liverpool. And when we were sitting in the living room with them, I went, that's what it felt like to sit in my living room when I was a kid. Not kind of in squalor, real kind of house proud, but that sense of they haven't got a lot of money, and so I think it's a fantastic show, The Gathering, and it storms the Cocker test. I think it's just a brilliant piece of work, and not enough people saw it, in my opinion.
Okay, no, that's good. There's a few examples, but again, as you say, it's hard to come up with them. But I love the Cocker test, and listen, that will not be the last that you'll hear of it. I'll be bringing this up on more interviews. If I have any more commissions, I'm really trying hard to get people in positions of influence who are different parts of our industry on, because it's really important, and I will be taking that idea to them and spreading it, and I'll make sure you're credited, Phil, don't worry, and Jarvis, of course.
No, credit Jarvis, not me.
I suppose I want to ask, because speaking of things like the caucasus, are there any other ideas? Because remember last time you were on the podcast, one of your ideas did sort of come into existence, so we can hope. But have you got any other solutions or ideas you think we could implement into, if anyone's listening, if in a position of more influence than us, that they could maybe try?
Well, I mean, God knows as I say in the keynote, listen, I'm a screenwriter, and we have about as much power to action change as a year-old iPhone after a full charge. So all of this is just me kind of thinking off the top of my head. So obviously, the Play for Today idea, Channel 5 have taken it up in a limited way, which is really fantastic. We've yet to see them. And I'm really looking forward to seeing them, and I hope they're really successful and they do more. And I also hope the other channels pick that up. But I think fundamentally what's at the heart of that, and I think what needs to happen is, there's something in the spirit of the way that, digital creators and online creators, and YouTube and TikTok creators, etc., are making stuff, which is sort of tantamount to this generation's punk, basically, which is you have the tools to make stuff, and you have the ability to distribute it. What you don't have is the ability to make a living from it, right? So I think if there's some way of connecting that, and I think that the difficulty that commissioners and executives and channels have is this whole issue about HETV and production values. And therefore the problem is that you make shows for less money, the fear is they look less good. But I remember, when just shortly after I came out of drama school, so in the mid-90s, shows like This Life and The Cops, and obviously it was an era when digital cameras had just sort of become a thing. So there was the possibility of working handheld, longer takes, shooting verite style. But those shows were made for comparatively at the time, tuppence halfpenny, but actually they reinvigorated storytelling and the realities of awful thing to say because none of us should have to do this, but doing more with less. So one of the things I'm working on at the moment, which I can't tell you what it is at the moment, but it's got a very, very small budget, but that's not impinging on the ambition of the stories that we want to tell and the kind of so we have to work within these parameters. And in a way, I learned that from doctors. For all doctors, and I'm not holding doctors up as an ideal perfect show because of course nothing is. But the strictures of the low budgets never impinged on the stories that we told, or the breadth of them, or the quality of them. And I think we have to start embracing that again, because if the pressure of high-end TV values means that we can't make lower budget stuff, then it really is going to disappear because there just isn't going to be the money to make them. So some way of dealing with that conundrum through innovation, through risk, through kind of, or even think about, sorry, I'm waffling, but think about when Armando Iannucci made the first series of The Thick of It, right? I think it was BBC Four that had just come into being, and BBC Four controller went, here's a tiny amount of money. Armando Iannucci made the first few series of The Thick of It in BBC buildings, pretending to be Whitehall. It just with digital cameras, and some actors, and something of that spirit of just going, well, what can you do with what you have, rather than it has to be up here, otherwise we're not going to even do it. We're not even going to attempt it. And I think something about going for those lower budgets as well means you can then take a risk on people that people haven't heard of, and give them the opportunity, because there's so many fantastic actors out there who are champing at the bit to do work and to do good work and will do good work if given a chance. So yeah, that's my
I think it's really good as well, because what we talked about at the start was we talked about YouTube's become the second most watched thing in the UK in terms of television, right? This will be on YouTube right now. I have very little money behind this podcast. I'm trying really hard to professionalize it more, and I'm really proud of how much we've grown in the last 5 years. But as an example of, as you say, the punk thing, I started this in my bedroom, and sometimes I'm lucky enough I can fund myself to go into a nice studio, or I can buy equipment to make this look a bit nicer, like tonight or whatever. But there is that ethos, and there's a lot of the skill set there. But I can't. It'd be impossible for me to make a living from this podcast right now in the current state of it. Majority of content creators are people in that position. It's similar, but there is. You're right. I think there must be something we can try and connect, and there is people doing that. But I know Channel 4 are trying to do a lot more digital stuff. I think they all are, but I think part of the reason
they all are.
Part of the reason it sometimes fails, though, is they try to do it with loads of money behind it, or in a way that feels inauthentic. You have to keep the authenticity of what content creators and people like that are able to do on YouTube. I think people care more about that than they do about the flashiness. So it's a great.
So that speaks to something that I'm really interested in, and I'd really love to dig at with you if we've got a little bit of time. Which is, for me, one of the things that has niggled at me and made me go, this seems to be a symptom of what's going wrong, right? Is the red carpet premiere for TV shows. Do you notice how, when the streamers came in, it started to be a thing of oh, there's got to be a red carpet premiere. And I'm like, why? Why is that? I'm all for celebrating cast and crew and that's, and I'm all for but so there's something about, it feels like we've kind of got into a thing of you can't make something unless it's going to be mega successful. And I was really struck, and again, this is just me sort of chewing on this. I was really struck by both Owen Cooper, the fantastic young boy in Adolescence who won the Emmy last night, and Stephen Graham, who won lots of Emmys, but he also won for acting. And when I saw their speeches, I wrote this down. So Owen Cooper said, when I started these drama classes a couple of years back, I was nothing about 3 years ago, and I'm here now, right? And then Stephen Graham started his speech by saying, this kind of thing doesn't normally happen to a kid like me. I'm just a mixed race kid from a block of flats in a place called Kirby. Now, Stephen Graham is one of the most brilliant, successful actors this country's produced in my generation, and I have no doubt that Owen Cooper will go on to be. But these are people from working class backgrounds, standing on the biggest stages of the world, going, this doesn't happen to people like me. And something about that thing of, is it less valuable to make work that doesn't get you on that stage, but still you're making work? Do you know what I mean? And this is my thing about magical thinking. Because we talked about it last time. I'm really passionate. The work should be the thing, not the success. And actually, that will then, for me, if the work becomes the thing, then the landscape and the ecosystem becomes healthier, because it isn't about I've got to become the next this or that. It's just I want to make work, and I want to just about be able to sustain myself doing it. I don't want to, I don't want to make a fortune. I just want to be able to sustain myself so that I can make the next thing and the next thing. There's something really interesting for me, and for me, that's symptomatic for some reason about these red carpet premieres for TV shows.
Yeah.
I just go, what? Really? Why do we need those?
It's really interesting.
So that's
It's really interesting, yeah, about that, the pinnacle thing. We did talk about that last time, and I do find the magical realism thing really interesting, in this constant idea, like, I've not made it, I need to get to this place, and then you get there, you're like, well, but I need to do this other episode and get more downloads if it's with the podcast, for example, or whatever it might be. And I think that's the artist. I think that's I think most creative people struggle with that thing where they're like, I don't know. And it's a complicated one, yeah. I think award ceremonies are kind of, I think I don't know if I would say wrong if that's too strong a word, but maybe they're a symptom of maybe capitalism in a way, where it's like you're chasing that thing. That could be what it is, like, without getting all make Right. I'll probably sound like a massive, like, big leftist tonight, but I don't even mean it.
You Marxist.
I don't know. It does interest me though. I think about that a lot. 'Cause sometimes I'm guilty of that, going, oh, I'd love to get an award for this podcast one day, like be recognised. And it's like, well, would you not rather just enjoy recording each episode? Is that really relevant? Yeah, it's a strange one.
I think it is. I think you're right. I think it is symptomatic of something, and I'm not saying it's wrong at all. I think I'm just more interested in, for example, imagine the pressure on Owen Cooper now. It looks like he has a fantastically supportive family, and obviously, he'll have the family of people who made Adolescence around him to take care of him. But imagine the pressure on him now, whatever the next thing he chooses to do, rather than, he's clearly an incredibly gifted young actor. He's 15, and there he is going, I was nothing 3 years ago. You were 12 3 years ago. You weren't nothing, and you aren't nothing now, and you won't be nothing tomorrow. So there's something for me about the intrinsic value of being an artist and being a creator, rather than this extrinsic thing. And I say this as somebody, who I'm as guilty of kind of desperately wanting to try and be successful. I've won awards, and it's complex and challenging to kind of win an award and then go the following day, well, oh, hang on, I've got to get up and walk the dog. It's so, yeah, there's something for me that obviously is a bee in my bonnet about just, my favorite film. This is a segue, but it does feed into this. My favorite film, and I'm not big into top fives or anything like this, but my favorite film consistently over the years has been a film called Big Night.
Great film, yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen Big Night. Stanley Tucci. And why I love Big Night so much, apart from the fact that it's a fantastic film. So it's Stanley Tucci, Campbell Scott directed it, and together. And Stanley Tucci is one of two brothers who run a restaurant in the Bronx, an Italian restaurant in the 1950s, and they're dying on their arse. And so they, along with Ian Holm playing the guy who runs the Brassy Trattoria across the road, who's always absolutely rammed with people while they're dying, he organizes to get this jazz band led by Louis Prima to come to their restaurant and kind of give them a big splash in the press. And the brothers are having a conversation about this, and the chef is like a real artist. He's a real creative artist. And he says to Stanley Tucci's character, people should come just for the food. They should come just for the food. And Stanley Tucci's character, Secondo, says, "I know, but they don't." And for me, that's the heart of the creative life and the challenge of the creative life, because you just want to make the work. And so that's why there's such a strong argument for trying to sustain in some way our public service broadcasting model, because the theory behind it is people should come just for the food. Every show that the BBC makes doesn't have to be Adolescence. It can be Just Act Normal, you know? And Just Act Normal is a fabulous show, but it's never going to do the kind of numbers that Adolescence does. And it doesn't have to, and it shouldn't have to. So that's what I get really passionate about, as you could tell.
And I suppose we're also, just to talk, we think we touched on this last time, but there's this need constantly that we need to make things for a global audience. And you do sometimes. You can do both. The best shows do both, but you should also need to make stuff for a local audience too. As you talked about, the high street needs to serve its local community as well as its, people who are tourists.
Yeah. Yeah, and the role of those shows in talking about us to us, you know. I've been really interested in the last year since we last spoke. How many assassin dramas have there been? Like Black Doves, the one with Keely Hawes. Oh, he's a spy, he's an assassin, he's a this, he's a that, and I go, yeah, why are those, the same, for the same reason there are so many cozy crime shows and cop shows and murder mysteries, because they sell around the world, and they're not specific to a place. And that's great that they're there in the market, but if there isn't space for the other kind of stories, then we have a monoculture, basically. We don't have a variety of stories that actually talk about us to us. And I think that's really problematic.
For sure. And then that's just going to keep driving people to all these other things on YouTube that feel more authentic and they connect to. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing either, but you want to sustain all of it. So we're approaching about an hour, Phil. So I want to ask you a few more questions. And I want to round off the sort of theme of our conversation. But before that, there's a few things I want to touch on. I want to talk to you personally about, I know you're working again, and last time we spoke, you hadn't worked for a bit, which has obviously been really tough, but congrats for that as well. I hope that's made things a bit easier for you. But are you able to talk to us a little bit about what you're working on? Or?
I can't really talk. This is one of the difficulties. I can't really say exactly what I'm working on. I'm working on, so I can't tell you what they are. I've done an episode of something of cozy crime. Well, I can say I've done an episode of Father Brown, which was the thing that kind of got me out of. I didn't have work for 18 months, which was, terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And really, really, without going into sort of too much detail or triggering detail, was incredibly difficult for my mental health. And in the midst of that, I put that thread on Twitter. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah. So I was really fortunate to get an episode of Father Brown, which got me back into the saddle. I'm working on something at the moment, which is a drama documentary about something, and that's going to be a feature-length drama documentary, and that's being made incredibly fast and shooting really soon. And then I'm writing a feature film, and I'm being paid to write a feature film, which is remarkable, because most feature films, you kind of write them on spec, or you're not paid, and then you try and sell them. So, and I've got one or two other things in the fire, but it's interesting talking again about class and talking about issues around the industry. One of the things you might have been aware of in the Edinburgh TV Festival was, in the wake of James Graham's McTaggart last year, the TV Foundation put together a working group and did a lot of research around working practices, and how they impact kind of working class people getting into and staying in the TV industry. And one of the things that's interesting, and this is not me calling out any of these jobs that I've got, I got none of them via any form of formal interview or recruitment process. I got them because there were people I'd worked with before. So this is the successocracy in action, right? I got them because people I'd worked with before were really kind enough to say, Phil, you'd be great for this. How do you feel about doing this? Or somebody I'd worked with before recommended me to somebody and said, oh, he's great, you should work with him. Or in one instance, the feature film, I have a particular research expertise in one area that chimed with the film that they were interested in making, and they said, oh, Phil knows a lot about this. So that's really interesting, right? Because you could argue, and some would argue, well, that's good, you're an experienced screenwriter, you've been working for 20 plus years, that's how it should work. But then if you don't and you aren't, How do you get those jobs
Um,
if they're not advertised? If there's no interview process? The TV Foundation's report on class and TV industry is really, really fantastic piece of work and really useful in terms of offering suggestions to indies and producers about how to, think about working class people in the industry.
No, it is really interesting to mention Peter Strachan again, who I would love to have on this podcast, and I'm trying to make that happen. But um, he did some great work recently about exclusive WhatsApp groups and things like that that have an effect on getting jobs in this industry. I've also benefited from it, and I think it's really, I appreciate you being so honest about that. I think many of it's just a lot of the time how this industry operates, but it is grossly unfair. It is grossly unfair because again, it plays into that exclusivity. And if you come from a working class background, or you have any sort of inequality or disadvantage, like a disability or whatever, it just makes it that little bit harder to get those opportunities, and it is a big issue. And yeah, for sure, I think something need to
Yeah.
work on.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to all the things that we've talked about, in terms of the successocracy and in terms of how the people who are responsible for kind of allocating those jobs, they are risk averse because it's their job on the line if they give it to somebody who can't deliver. And so their risk aversion means that they go, okay, well, this person, I know I can trust them to deliver. In my case, I hope that's what people that employ me feel, and I certainly attempt to do that. So, it's about that, and it isn't about them going, oh, I just want to work with my mates. Of course, that might be the case in some instances, but actually, the reality is it's always, particularly now, it's people under pressure trying to, do their jobs as well as they can and keep their jobs and, and make good telly in the meantime. So it's, yeah, but it means that if you can't, if you don't have the means to get in there, or even if you've got an agent and, your agent gets whiff that there might be work, they can put you forward for it, but that doesn't mean that, you'll get seen or that they'll give you a chance. Or so it's but really hard, really hard.
I know, for sure, for sure. I have a few more questions to ask you. For one of them is, and I'm going to start asking. This is the first time I've asked this question on the podcast, actually, but I'm going to start asking guests about the worst advice they'd had. Because well, I always ask them about the best, and I asked you this last time. But what do you think the worst bit of advice you've heard, or you think is out there for people?
It's a really, really difficult question, and it isn't a difficult question because I don't want to say because somebody gave me terrible advice and fuck them. But I think actually probably this is kind of fobbing off the question, Jamie, I think, but the worst piece of advice I ever got was the one thing that as a writer you don't want to hear. So I remember I wrote my first play and I completely, poured myself heart and soul into this play. And I really thought this is fantastic. This is amazing. And I remember giving it to somebody who was a director I'd worked with as an actor. I said, I've wrote my first play. I'd love your thoughts. Thinking, he's going to go, oh my God, you're an undiscovered genius. You're Harold Pinter. We're going to put this on. You're going to be a star. Talking about, the star thing. And he read it and he went, yeah, it's really good. Write another. And that was literally all he said to me. He just went, it's really good. Write another. And I was like, I was so totally deflated. And I was like, what do you mean? He went, well, you just have to write another one now. And it's the worst piece of advice, but it's actually, of course, it's the best piece of advice because that's the other thing. We haven't even touched on AI in any of
No,
our
we haven't
conversations.
actually, which is a surprise for me. My friend is sick of me banging on about it.
Man, I'm like I'm like the touch paper. Whenever it comes up, people stand back. But in a time when every time you go onto YouTube, you'll get an advert for Grammarly or some such, going, writing can be difficult, so let AI do it. And I go, yeah, it's supposed to be difficult because we're human beings, and that's what creativity is, right? It's supposed to be difficult, and actually, I love the difficulty. I love banging my head against the laptop and then having to get up and go and walk the dog and just go, what the hell am I doing? And then coming back and trying and being shit and then writing some more and then eventually going, oh my God, I've got it. And then getting better by doing, and in a way, I think something of the risk aversion that we talk about in our industry comes from that sense of people are desperately afraid of having to get better by failing and learning by failing and learning by not being very good. And I have conversations a lot, because I'm longer in the tooth than I might wish to be with young people or younger people or people who are starting out in the industry. And I know what they want is the magic clue to the kingdom. And as a script editor, there isn't one. The magic clue to the kingdom is write another draft.
You might get lucky.
You just write another draft or write another play. So yeah, so that was the biggest deflation, because there was me thinking I was going to be the Mozart of playwrights, and him just going, yeah, it's good, write another one.
We don't have time, obviously, to touch on AI properly, but just to very quickly think, I think one of the risks of it is you lose the skills. Again, we talked earlier, you need to enjoy the journey. If you don't have the journey at all, then you're not going to learn the resilience, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's going to be in a really interesting time with it. And I'm hopefully going to be doing an episode all about AI soon as well. So the listeners to look out for. This is probably my favorite subject at the moment. And I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic. So there is benefits to AI as well and spell check and stuff. No one's denying that, but it is a big worry. One of the last questions I want to ask you is actually, is there anything that I've missed tonight, Phil, that you maybe want to quickly speak on apart from AI? Is there anything you'd like to add to our conversation?
I don't think so. I find I was so kind of anxious and nervous before coming on, thinking I've got nothing to say to Jamie, and then I discovered that I've rambled on for ages. No, I mean, I suppose, just to reiterate, I feel like I am TV's Mick Lynch. But which my partner will think is absolutely hilarious, I have to tell you. But if I am TV's Mick Lynch, like him or like I perceive him to be, it's because I'm so passionate about it. And I'm so passionate about the brilliant stories that aren't being told because of the way that the industry is currently operating and the austerity that is just awash in the industry. And so I just really, really want those who have any degree of power to be a little bit braver and just go, actually, the only way this industry will survive is if we invest in it, is if we risk, if we try new things, if we maybe take the pressure off to be the next Adolescence, because then eventually we will get the next Adolescence and it will be amazing, but we won't get there if we don't invest. So yeah, that's
Yeah. Well, last question for you, Phil, but have you got a reason for us to be optimistic about the future of it in any way? Because it does, I know I talk about this issue a lot on the podcast, and I've had a few friends go, bloody hell, you're miserable, aren't you? I think this is important though, and I think we are. I hope we talk about this in an entertaining and balanced enough way as well, because, it's the reality, and I think people find it really cathartic. And they need to hear the honesty, and they need to hear what it's really like on the ground. But have you got any reasons for us to be optimistic?
I mean, I think if I've got reasons to be optimistic, it's because I think enough people recognize that the current situation is not sustainable. So actually, with my other hat on, what I do when I'm not screenwriting is I run with my partner. This isn't an advert, by the way. I run with my partner a little retreat center in our home in Wales, and we do rites of passage retreats. So we take people, we help people navigate change, which basically all stories are change, right? And so in doing that, I'm really interested and passionate in how we go through change. And change is really painful because we have to sever from the old way of doing things. We have to move away from that. If you think about Lord of the Rings, it's Frodo leaving Hobbiton to have to go to Mount Doom. And then there's this horrible, sticky, shitty bit in the middle where we don't know what we're doing. We don't know where we're going. We don't know who we are. Nothing works. It's all messy. And then eventually you arrive at a point where all of it comes into its own and you become this new person. You navigate your way through. And for me, I think TV's right in that sticky, shitty middle bit. But I do trust that there are enough tools and there are enough brilliant storytellers and enough people to go, actually, we can't keep doing things the way that we've been doing them. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always had. Things have to change, and I know they'll change for the better eventually. So yeah, that's my optimism.
I'm going to keep talking about them until they do. Phil, I think that's a great place to end things on. I could easily talk to you all night. It's always a pleasure having you on the show, and as I did the first time and the second time, I've loved our third conversation, and I genuinely really appreciate all the work you're continuing to do. I hope the keynote goes well, and honestly, thank you so much for everything you're doing in the industry, and it's just always such a pleasure to talk to you. I always leave our conversations just, happy and buzzing, and this is why I do the podcast. I get to have great conversations like this, so thank you very much.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on again. And also, not to kind of blow smoke up your arse, but I think it's fantastic that you're doing this podcast and continuing to do it and have these conversations that I think the industry so needs. So yeah, right back at you.
Thank you, man.